He was a highly arrogant, toxic architect who highly maliciously divorced his highly devoted wife entirely because he highly toxically believed she was absolutely just a highly pathetic, penniless housewife who brought absolutely nothing to his highly elite status. He highly publicly humiliated her, highly proudly parading his highly glamorous 26-year-old pregnant mistress directly in front, entirely of his highly cruel, elitist mother, highly toxically handing his loyal wife the highly brutal divorce papers exactly on their highly romantic 3rd anniversary. He genuinely, toxically thought he was highly efficiently getting completely rid entirely of highly pathetic, dead weight. He possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that the exact quiet wife he literally just violently destroyed was officially, secretly, the absolute sole heir entirely to a 4 trillion ruble or $50 billion massive global empire. And exactly when he confidently struts completely into the highly exclusive boardroom entirely to highly proudly sign the highly massive merger that will absolutely make his highly pathetic career, he doesn't successfully meet a highly elite board of directors. He successfully meets his highly publicly discarded ex-wife, flawlessly sitting perfectly in the highly coveted chairman's chair, highly actively preparing to completely, violently annihilate his absolute entire, massive existence. Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful family. If you fiercely believe that absolute karma always successfully collects its highly massive debts, and you absolutely love highly explosive stories of ultimate revenge and pure resilience, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button to strongly support our content, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if your partner dumped you for a younger assistant in the comments below. Let's get directly into The Billionaire's Secret. Part 1. The Anniversary Ambush. The highly imposing grandfather clock entirely, in the highly massive hallway entirely of the highly exclusive sterling luxury mansion, loudly struck exactly 7 agonizing times. The highly heavy sound loudly echoed completely across the highly cold, imported marble floor, exactly like a highly terrifying. It was highly officially supposed entirely to absolutely be a highly festive celebration. It was officially the highly anticipated 3rd wedding anniversary entirely of Julian Sterling and Victoria, but the highly toxic atmosphere entirely in the highly massive dining room was so incredibly highly thick that you could highly easily completely suffocate perfectly in it. Victoria sat peacefully, entirely at the absolute far end, entirely of the highly long, polished mahogany table. For exactly half the highly exhausting day, she had highly lovingly, meticulously prepared highly delicious roast beef. Exactly, precisely exactly how Julian highly fiercely loved it. Completely rare and perfectly garnished, completely with highly creamy horseradish. But exactly when she highly proudly served it, she was highly coldly, explicitly told that they were highly actively waiting entirely for a highly important guest. She intensely looked completely down directly at her soft hands. They were highly visibly red, completely from highly actively scrubbing the highly massive floors significantly earlier. Exactly that highly exhausting day, despite the highly absolute fact that Victoria had happily married completely into the highly wealthy, elite Sterling family, she had absolutely never, ever been highly respectfully treated exactly like a highly proper wife. For Eleanor Sterling, the highly terrifying, elitist matriarch whose highly freezing gaze could highly easily, completely freeze a highly burning hot fire. Victoria was absolutely nothing significantly more than a highly glorified, pathetic maid. "Absolutely stop! Highly pathetically fidgeting, Victoria!" Eleanor violently snapped completely from the absolute head entirely of the massive table. She highly toxically adjusted her highly expensive pearl necklace, violently narrowing her piercing eyes. "Exactly that highly pathetically actively makes you visually look incredibly nervous and highly guilty." "I highly profusely apologize, Eleanor," Victoria whispered incredibly softly, gently placing her soft hands perfectly on her fragile lap. I highly genuinely thought we would happily eat highly delicious dinner exactly at 6 p.m. The highly delicious food is actively getting incredibly cold. We highly happily eat exactly when Julian highly explicitly says, Eleanor violently retorted. Exactly this highly busy week. He is highly actively concluding the absolute greatest, highly massive deal entirely of his entire massive life. A highly massive merger completely with the highly powerful Vanguard Group. But I highly accurately assume exactly. That explicitly means absolutely nothing completely to a highly pathetic woman, exactly like you. You have absolutely never, ever brutally worked a highly single massive day entirely in your highly pathetic life. Victoria violently bit her soft lip entirely to highly aggressively suppress a highly genuine, pure laugh. The Vanguard Group. If they absolutely only profoundly knew. Right, entirely. In exactly that highly specific moment. The highly heavy oak doors completely, violently, swung completely wide open. Julian confidently entered, visually looking exactly, perfectly exactly, like the highly brilliant rising star entirely of elite architecture that he highly arrogantly styled completely himself, entirely, to absolutely be. He was incredibly handsome, completely with a sharp jawline that you could highly easily, completely, cut completely. Yourself perfectly on, flawlessly wearing highly expensive bespoke Italian suits, highly strategically designed entirely to highly secretly hide the highly terrifying fact that his highly pathetic architectural firm was completely, violently drowning completely in highly massive debts. But he absolutely was not completely alone, fiercely clinging directly to his strong arm. Flawlessly wearing a highly scandalous, bright red designer silk dress that highly likely cost significantly more than the absolute entire, pathetic wardrobe entirely of Victoria, was officially Chloe. Chloe was officially the highly glamorous daughter entirely of exactly one entirely of the highly minor, pathetic local investors entirely in the massive city. She was incredibly loud, highly flashy, and entirely for the absolute last 6 agonizing months, had absolutely been brutally working exactly as the highly elite personal assistant entirely of Julian. Victoria profoundly knew exactly this. She had vividly seen the highly toxic, secret messages. She had highly clearly smelled the highly expensive, toxic perfume. But she had highly bravely stayed, highly desperately hoping that Julian would highly miraculously remember the exact true man he absolutely was, exactly when they beautifully met entirely in a highly simple coffee shop exactly 3 agonizing years completely ago, exactly when he was incredibly humble, and she was absolutely just simply Vicky. "Julian!" Victoria confidently stood completely up, her highly cheap napkin smoothly slipping directly to the hard floor. What exactly is she actively doing perfectly here? Julian didn't absolutely even highly actively look entirely at her. He highly gallantly pulled completely out a highly comfortable chair entirely for Chloe. Perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to his highly arrogant mother. Safely sit completely down, Victoria. We highly desperately need to actively talk. Chloe smirked highly toxically, highly provocatively tossing her beautiful blonde hair completely over her fragile shoulder exactly as she sat heavily down. Hello, Victoria. The highly pathetic roast beef visually looks incredibly dry. Eleanor highly toxically scoffed, highly elegantly sipping her highly expensive Chardonnay. Finally, entirely at absolute least, absolutely some highly vibrant color, perfectly at exactly this massive table. Chloe, my beautiful darling, you visually look completely, utterly stunning. Thank you so incredibly much, Eleanor. Chloe highly seductively purred. Julian has highly actively told me so incredibly, highly much entirely about your highly exquisite elite taste. Victoria safely remained completely standing, her massive heart violently pounding completely against her fragile ribs. Julian, today is officially our highly anticipated anniversary. I profoundly know exactly what highly specific day, exactly today, absolutely is. Julian stated completely, with a deep voice, completely devoid, entirely of absolutely any emotion. He finally smoothly turned directly to his loyal wife. His piercing eyes were incredibly cold and highly hard. Exactly that is exactly, precisely, exactly why I highly specifically chose exactly today. It physically seemed highly beautifully poetic, entirely to completely violently end absolutely everything exactly on the highly specific day that it highly tragically began. He confidently reached completely into his highly expensive leather briefcase and smoothly pulled completely out a highly thick yellow manila envelope. He highly aggressively pushed it completely across the massive mahogany table. It completely stopped perfectly, right perfectly in front, entirely of the highly empty plate, entirely of Victoria. Highly official divorce papers, Julian stated incredibly dryly. A highly heavy, deafening silence completely, violently fell completely over the massive room. Violently. Broken. Absolutely. Only completely by the highly sharp clinking entirely of the expensive fork. Entirely of Chloe, exactly as she highly casually picked completely at the roast beef. Are you completely 100% joking? Victoria whispered incredibly softly, violently clearing her dry throat. I absolutely do not highly pathetically joke entirely about my highly massive future, Julian firmly replied. Intensely look directly at completely yourself, Victoria. Intensely look completely at exactly this. He highly vaguely pointed directly at her highly simple cotton dress and her highly complete lack entirely of highly expensive jewelry. I am highly actively about to miraculously become a highly elite senior partner entirely of the Vanguard Group. I will absolutely be a highly elite, world-class, massive player. I highly desperately need a highly glamorous elite wife who flawlessly matches exactly that highly elite role. A highly elite wife who highly successfully brings highly massive connections, highly massive capital, and highly absolute class. And you absolutely only highly pathetically bring highly cheap laundry detergent and highly pathetic silence. I highly faithfully supported you, Victoria stated, her beautiful voice violently trembling. Absolutely not entirely from hot tears, but entirely from white-hot, absolute rage. When you highly desperately opened the highly pathetic firm, who exactly absolutely didn't peacefully sleep entirely for agonizing nights, highly meticulously keeping the highly complex bookkeeping? Who exactly highly efficiently organized your highly chaotic schedule? Who exactly highly lovingly comforted you exactly when the highly aggressive bank violently threatened highly absolute foreclosure entirely on the highly heavily mortgaged, pathetic property? Highly pathetic administrative work, Eleanor highly toxically scoffed, highly dismissively waving her expensive hand. Absolutely any highly cheap secretary, completely on highly pathetic minimum wage, could highly easily have highly successfully done exactly that. Chloe, entirely on the absolute other highly glamorous hand, absolutely only entirely in exactly this highly short month, has highly successfully introduced Julian directly to exactly 3 highly massive elite real estate developers. And, Chloe highly aggressively added, smoothly leaning significantly closer, completely with a highly predatory, toxic gleam entirely in her piercing eyes. I am heavily pregnant. Absolutely all the heavy air completely, violently abandoned the massive room. Victoria frantically looked completely from the highly smug, toxic face, entirely of Chloe, directly to the highly defiant, arrogant face, entirely of Julian. It is officially a highly handsome boy, Julian stated completely, with exactly such highly massive, arrogant pride entirely in his deep voice that he had absolutely never, ever highly actively demonstrated completely to Victoria. A highly coveted heir, exactly what you were highly clearly completely incapable entirely of highly miraculously giving completely to me. It was an absolute, highly brutal blow, completely below the highly fragile belt. Absolutely. Both entirely of them profoundly knew that Victoria absolutely could not miraculously get heavily pregnant, entirely due completely to highly complex medical complications. Highly tragic complications, entirely about which she had highly honestly, explicitly told Julian completely before their beautiful wedding, and entirely about which he had highly fiercely sworn absolutely did not actively matter. Victoria incredibly slowly, gently reached completely out and highly softly touched the thick envelope. You highly fiercely want a highly brutal divorce entirely because my highly pathetic status absolutely is not highly sufficiently high, completely enough entirely for you. Because you highly arrogantly genuinely believe that you have completely outgrown me. It is absolutely just highly simple business, Victoria, Julian stated, smoothly pouring himself a highly expensive glass entirely of vintage wine. Do absolutely not highly pathetically make a highly dramatic scene. The highly strict conditions are completely 100% fair. You highly generously get the highly old, pathetic Honda, and I will highly generously give you exactly $20,000 or 2 million rubles, entirely in highly liquid cash, entirely to highly bravely start completely anew. But you will confidently leave the massive house exactly tonight. Chloe is highly actively moving completely in. Exactly tonight? Victoria softly asked. Exactly tonight, Eleanor violently commanded. I will absolutely not highly generously allow exactly this to highly agonizingly drag completely on. Highly officially sign the highly strict documents. Take the highly pathetic check and safely return directly to exactly that highly pathetic, cheap little apartment completely from which you highly pathetically crawled completely out. Victoria intensely looked directly at absolutely all highly toxic, three entirely of them. A highly ambitious, incredibly unfaithful, arrogant husband. A highly cruel, highly elitist, toxic mother. Highly maliciously obsessed completely with highly fake class status. A highly greedy, toxic mistress. They visually looked exactly like a highly perfect, flawless painting flawlessly depicting highly absolute greed. She absolutely did not violently cry. The highly massive sadness that she had highly actively expected to profoundly feel highly instantly, completely, violently, burned completely away, entirely into a highly freezing, sharp, absolute clarity. She smoothly opened the thick envelope. She absolutely did not highly meticulously read the highly strict conditions. She absolutely did not highly pathetically ask entirely for a highly expensive lawyer. She smoothly pulled a highly cheap ballpoint pen completely from her highly simple pocket, and completely with a highly firm, completely unshakable, soft hand, she highly proudly signed her beautiful name, Victoria Vanguard, or Vorontsova. Usually she highly officially signed Victoria Sterling, but exactly today, she completely, proudly returned directly to her highly beautiful maiden name. They were way too incredibly highly busy, highly maliciously gloating, entirely to highly astutely notice the highly massive difference. Completely done, Victoria stated, highly aggressively pushing the highly official documents completely back. Highly smart, beautiful girl, Julian stated completely with highly massive relief. He highly casually threw his highly expensive checkbook completely onto the massive table. I will highly rapidly write the highly pathetic check right exactly now. Safely keep it, Victoria stated, her beautiful voice violently dropping exactly one highly terrifying octave. Completely, violently losing its highly soft, submissive, pathetic note. You will highly desperately need absolutely every single pathetic penny. I highly profusely apologize. Chloe laughed highly bitterly. Is exactly that a highly pathetic threat? Victoria smoothly turned completely around and confidently headed directly toward the heavy door. She absolutely did not actively look completely back. It absolutely is not a highly pathetic threat, Chloe. It is highly solid financial advice. Interactive question. Victoria just signed the divorce papers and left her husband with a warning. Do you think Julian will regret letting her go so easily? Tell us your thoughts below. Part 2. The Awakening of the Titan. The highly heavy front door entirely of the highly massive Sterling mansion violently slammed completely shut, completely behind her. Completely, violently, cutting completely off the highly warm heat and the highly bright light entirely of the massive estate outside. The pitch-black night was incredibly chilly. A highly light, freezing drizzle aggressively began to violently fall, flawlessly blurring the highly cracked windshield entirely of the highly pathetic 10-year-old Honda Civic peacefully parked perfectly on the highly expansive driveway. The absolute only highly pathetic asset that she had absolutely been highly generously permitted entirely to highly pathetically keep. Victoria violently lingered entirely for exactly one highly brief moment, perfectly on the highly cold porch, intensely listening directly to the highly muffled, toxic laughter loudly drifting completely from the massive dining room. They were highly happily proposing highly festive toasts, highly eagerly celebrating her highly brutal removal exactly as if she absolutely were a highly toxic tumor, completely, violently excised, completely from the highly elite body entirely of the massive family. She confidently walked directly to the cheap car, smoothly opened the highly rusty trunk, and highly carelessly threw perfectly inside the absolute only highly pathetic cardboard box that she had highly meticulously packed significantly earlier. Exactly that highly exhausting morning. She profoundly knew that exactly this would highly eventually violently happen. Perhaps absolutely not the highly toxic pregnancy, but the highly catastrophic end. Julian had absolutely been incredibly distant entirely for agonizing months, highly maliciously hiding his expensive phone, confidently returning completely home, heavily reeking entirely of highly elite gin and highly toxic deception. She had highly meticulously prepared. She smoothly slid directly onto the highly uncomfortable driver's seat. The highly cheap interior violently smelled entirely of highly stale coffee and highly cheap vanilla air freshener that she had highly pathetically bought entirely to highly successfully mask the highly toxic smell entirely of the highly sweaty gym bag, entirely of Julian. She highly smoothly inserted the highly cheap key directly into the highly rusty ignition, but she absolutely did not actively turn it. Instead, she confidently reached completely into the highly dusty glove compartment and smoothly pulled completely out a highly sleek, highly advanced black satellite phone, completely on a highly secure, encrypted line. It was a highly terrifying device that she absolutely had not actively turned completely on entirely in exactly 3 agonizing years. She highly aggressively pressed the highly secure power button. The bright screen brilliantly flashed, flawlessly displaying a highly simple, elegant logo, a highly massive golden letter V flawlessly intertwined completely with a highly triumphant laurel wreath. She highly rapidly dialed the absolute only highly secure number. It loudly rang exactly 1 highly short time. "Madam Vanguard," answered a highly deep, incredibly intelligent voice. It was officially Arthur, the highly terrifying elite chief of staff entirely of Vanguard Holdings, and the exact loyal man who had highly lovingly raised her completely after her highly loving parents were highly tragically killed, entirely in a highly catastrophic plane crash, ruthlessly leaving her exactly as the absolute sole heir entirely to a highly terrifying, global massive empire, officially valued entirely at exactly $50 billion, or 4 trillion rubles. "It is completely, permanently over, Arthur," Victoria stated. In her beautiful voice, perfectly, there was absolutely nothing completely left. Entirely of the highly meek, pathetic housewife who had literally just absolutely been highly brutally thrown completely out directly onto the freezing street. It was absolute, pure steel and highly freezing ice. "I am incredibly, profoundly sorry, entirely to highly clearly hear exactly that, Victoria. Or perhaps highly massive congratulations are significantly more highly appropriate?" Arthur softly asked. He highly officially signed the highly brutal divorce papers. He is currently completely with a beautiful woman explicitly named Chloe, and is highly anxiously waiting entirely for the highly massive meeting, entirely regarding the highly anticipated merger exactly on highly anticipated Monday. "Yes, he highly eagerly is," Arthur firmly confirmed. "The highly elite board of directors is highly actively preparing the highly official, final contracts entirely for the highly aggressive acquisition entirely of Sterling Architecture. They highly genuinely believe that they are highly successfully acquiring a highly promising, elite firm completely with a highly brilliant, visionary leader. Highly aggressively suspend the highly complex contracts," Victoria violently commanded. "Suspend absolutely everything. completely, violently cancel the highly massive takeover offer, she stated, intensely watching exactly as the highly bright lights entirely of the massive house beautifully flickered entirely in the highly cracked rearview mirror. And highly urgently initiate highly strict red protocol entirely for Sterling architecture. I highly desperately need a highly complete, rigorous forensic audit entirely of absolutely all their highly secure accounts, aggressively starting exactly tomorrow, highly early morning. Absolutely every single highly pathetic invoice, absolutely every single highly official permit, absolutely every single highly complex tax return. That is incredibly aggressive, Arthur highly astutely noted. Exactly, although she could highly clearly hear the highly proud smile entirely in his deep voice. And exactly what entirely about the highly anticipated meeting exactly on Monday? We absolutely keep the highly anticipated meeting, Victoria stated, but highly smoothly change the highly exclusive location. Highly elite boardroom, a perfectly on the highly massive penthouse level. And Arthur, yes, Madam Vanguard, highly aggressively ensure that highly elite security profoundly knows. Mr. Sterling absolutely must not be highly respectfully treated exactly as a highly elite VIP guest. He is officially a highly pathetic vendor, and a completely, violently bankrupt, exactly one, completely at exactly that. Completely understood. Where exactly will you absolutely be safely staying? The highly massive luxury penthouse has absolutely been highly meticulously prepared. I am confidently returning completely home, Arthur. Highly urgently, send a highly armored car directly to the highly quiet intersection, entirely of Lexington and 5th, or Lenin and Sadovaya. I will highly carelessly abandon exactly this highly pathetic piece entirely of junk. Perfectly right. Exactly there. Victoria smoothly started the highly old Honda, highly carefully reversing completely out entirely of the highly expansive driveway. She vividly saw entirely in the large window the highly arrogant silhouette entirely of Julian, highly proudly raising a highly expensive glass entirely of vintage champagne. He visually looked exactly like a highly powerful king, highly arrogantly surveying his highly massive domain. Highly happily enjoy it, Julian, she whispered incredibly softly. Exactly that is officially the absolute last, highly expensive drink you will absolutely ever highly happily enjoy. She highly safely drove directly to the highly specified intersection. A highly quiet, dark place entirely in the absolute center, entirely of the massive city. Perfectly there, safely parked perfectly by the quiet curb, completely with their highly massive engines, highly quietly running. Was officially a highly terrifying convoy, entirely of exactly 3 highly armored, massive black SUVs. A highly incredibly tall man, flawlessly wearing a highly dark, severe suit, confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly massive lead vehicle. A highly expensive Rolls-Royce Phantom. Arthur visually looked significantly older than she intimately remembered him. His highly distinguished hair was exactly now completely, flawlessly white. But his highly imposing posture safely remained exactly as incredibly rigid, exactly as absolutely always. He smoothly opened the highly heavy rear door entirely of the massive Phantom. Highly warmly welcome completely back, Madam Chairman, Arthur stated, incredibly slightly beautifully bowing his highly distinguished head. Victoria confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly cheap Honda, highly carelessly leaving the highly cheap keys perfectly in the highly rusty ignition, and the heavy door completely wide open. She absolutely didn't even actively look completely back entirely at exactly it. She smoothly slid completely into the highly luxurious, expensive leather interior entirely of the massive Rolls-Royce. Completely, instantly, flawlessly enveloped, completely by the highly exclusive elite world she had highly bravely abandoned entirely for highly pure love. A highly pure love that highly tragically turned completely out entirely to absolutely be a highly cheap, toxic fake. "Arthur," Victoria stated, exactly as the highly expensive car smoothly moved, flawlessly merging completely into the highly busy city traffic. "Highly urgently, get me the highly complete dossier entirely on the highly pathetic investments, entirely of the highly arrogant father, entirely of Chloe. And highly urgently, find the absolute best, highly elite intellectual property lawyer entirely in the massive city. Julian highly toxically genuinely thinks he is officially a highly brilliant architect. I am actively going to highly brutally remind him that exactly half entirely of his highly genius massive projects were highly casually sketched, completely on highly cheap napkins, completely by his highly pathetic wife." Arthur highly smoothly handed her a highly advanced tablet. "I am absolutely already exactly one massive step, completely ahead entirely of you and the highly toxic family entirely of Victoria." Victoria highly rapidly scrolled completely through the highly complex information perfectly on the bright tablet. Her beautiful face brilliantly illuminated completely by the highly bright blue light entirely of the bright screen. Eleanor highly toxically cares entirely about exactly two highly pathetic things: her highly fake social standing and her highly exclusive charity gala exactly next highly anticipated weekend. Highly aggressively buy the highly exclusive venue. Highly aggressively buy the highly expensive hotel exactly where the highly elite gala is highly officially held. Completely, violently, cancel her highly expensive reservation. Highly explicitly tell them that we are highly actively doing highly massive renovations. Arthur laughed loudly. "Incredibly, highly excellent. It actively begins." Victoria is unleashing her billionaire power. Which part of her revenge plan is your favorite so far? Tell us below. Part 3. The boardroom execution. The highly agonizing weekend completely, violently flew completely by, entirely for the highly arrogant Sterlings, entirely in a highly thick fog, entirely of highly hedonistic, toxic celebration. Julian and Chloe highly happily spent the highly sunny Saturday, highly expensively buying highly expensive designer baby clothes, and highly arrogantly touring highly luxurious penthouses that they absolutely could not highly possibly successfully afford completely yet. But Julian was incredibly, highly confident. The highly massive deal completely with the Vanguard Group was completely, flawlessly, securely in his deep pocket. It was officially an absolute $4 billion, or 4 billion rubles, massive acquisition. He was highly officially slated entirely to miraculously become the highly elite chief operating officer, entirely of the highly massive new division. He was completely, utterly untouchable. Eleanor highly eagerly spent her highly precious time highly frantically calling her highly elite circle entirely of fake friends. Highly subtly, toxically hinting that Julian had finally, highly successfully, gotten completely rid entirely of the highly pathetic, dead weight, and that the highly arrogant family was highly actively, entirely about to seamlessly transition completely into a highly brand new, significantly higher, massive tax bracket. She highly maliciously painted Victoria exactly as a highly tragic, pathetic, clingy figure who highly pathetically had to absolutely be highly expensively paid, completely off entirely. So exactly that she would highly cowardly leave on highly anticipated Monday, highly early morning. Julian flawlessly dressed completely in his absolute best, highly bespoke Italian suit. He highly proudly checked his handsome reflection entirely in the massive mirror. You visually look exactly like a highly powerful billionaire, Chloe seductively purred completely from the massive bed, highly lovingly rubbing her massive belly. Absolutely not completely yet. Julian smirked highly toxically, highly meticulously adjusting his highly expensive tie. But exactly by high noon, I will absolutely be incredibly, highly close, completely, to exactly it. He highly aggressively grabbed his highly expensive leather briefcase. I will absolutely vividly see you entirely at highly delicious dinner. Highly urgently book a highly exclusive table entirely in the highly elite Empire restaurant. We will highly aggressively celebrate exactly as highly, properly, exactly as highly, possibly, possible. Julian confidently drove directly to the highly imposing Vanguard Tower, the absolute tallest, most highly magnificent skyscraper entirely in the massive city. It was an absolute, terrifying monolith, entirely of freezing glass and solid steel that completely, violently dominated the highly beautiful skyline. Confidently pulling completely up directly to the highly elite valet, he highly importantly, arrogantly, tossed him his expensive keys. Highly securely keep it incredibly close. I will absolutely only be a highly brief while, Julian stated. He confidently entered the highly massive, awe-inspiring lobby, highly eagerly expecting entirely to absolutely be highly respectfully greeted completely by a highly elite team entirely of massive executives. Instead, he was highly coldly met completely by a highly stone-faced, massive security guard. Highly official name? The massive guard sharply asked. Absolutely not, actively tearing his piercing gaze completely off his advanced tablet. Julian Sterling, the highly famous CEO entirely of Sterling Architecture. I officially possess a highly important meeting completely with the highly elite board of directors. The massive guard highly smoothly swiped his massive finger completely down the highly strict list. Sterling. Sterling. Ah. Yes, vendor. You are absolutely not perfectly on the highly exclusive list entirely for the highly secure VIP elevator. You will highly unfortunately have to highly actively take the highly pathetic service elevator completely up directly to the exactly 40th floor, and then highly actively make a highly annoying transfer. Julian rapidly blinked. I highly profusely apologize. I am highly actively selling my highly massive division completely to exactly this massive company. There absolutely must officially be a highly pathetic mistake. Absolutely zero highly pathetic mistake, sir. Highly official badge. The massive guard highly aggressively slapped a highly cheap plastic visitor badge completely onto the highly polished counter, violently boiling completely with pure anger. Julian highly aggressively snatched the highly cheap badge. A highly pathetic, stupid clerical error, he highly toxically, explicitly told, completely himself. The absolute precise moment I highly officially sign the highly massive deal, I will highly aggressively order exactly this highly arrogant guard entirely to absolutely be highly publicly fired. He highly humiliatingly rode completely up entirely in the highly pathetic service elevator, highly uncomfortably squeezed completely between a highly smelly food cart and a highly tired janitor. It highly aggressively smelled entirely of highly cheap bleach. A highly toxic smell that highly unpleasantly violently reminded him entirely of Victoria. He highly aggressively waved exactly that highly annoying thought completely away. When he finally highly exhaustedly reached the highly exclusive top floor, he was highly rudely directed, absolutely, not directly, to the highly grand main conference room that he had vividly seen entirely in highly elite magazines, but directly to a highly small, pathetic waiting area completely outside the highly massive boardroom. He highly humiliatingly sat perfectly there, entirely, for exactly 20 minutes. Then, exactly 40 agonizing minutes. By the absolute time, the highly heavy double doors finally smoothly opened. Julian was completely, violently sweating. His highly toxic confidence had highly aggressively begun to completely, violently, crack completely at the highly fragile seams. "Mr. Sterling," a highly young elite assistant highly loudly called. "The highly elite board of directors is completely ready entirely to highly actively receive you." Julian confidently stood completely up, highly aggressively pulling completely down his bespoke suit. "It is highly officially about massive time." He confidently entered the highly massive boardroom. It was completely, utterly enormous. Completely with highly breathtaking panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, completely from which highly breathtakingly opened a highly massive view, completely over the entire massive city. In the absolute center safely stood a highly long, imposing table. Completely around it safely sat exactly 12 highly terrifying people. Massive men and beautiful women, entirely in highly bespoke suits that highly easily cost significantly more than the highly expensive car. Entirely of Julian. These were officially absolute titans, entirely of highly elite industry. He highly flawlessly recognized highly several massive faces completely from the highly exclusive financial news. But the highly coveted chair perfectly at the absolute head entirely of the massive table. The highly imposing chair entirely of the absolute chairman was completely, violently, turned completely toward the large window. "Highly esteemed gentlemen, beautiful ladies," Julian stated, highly aggressively turning completely on his highly commanding toxic CEO voice. "Thank you so incredibly much entirely for highly generously inviting me. I highly accurately assume the highly official documents are completely ready." A highly incredibly tall man, completely with highly distinguished white hair and a highly severe face. Arthur confidently spoke completely from the absolute right entirely of the highly coveted chairman's chair. "Mr. Sterling, highly politely take a comfortable seat." Julian sat heavily down. He profoundly felt incredibly, highly small. "Before we highly actively smoothly move completely forward completely with the highly anticipated takeover," Arthur stated, smoothly opening a highly thick folder. "We officially possess a highly few short questions entirely regarding the highly complex financial reporting entirely of Sterling architecture. Absolutely everything is completely, perfectly fine," Julian highly rapidly stated. "My highly devoted wife, my highly ex-wife, highly meticulously kept the highly complex bookkeeping. But I highly personally, highly rigorously checked them. Yes, we completely know," Arthur stated. "We have highly successfully discovered absolutely some highly concerning massive inconsistencies. Highly particularly, entirely regarding the highly absolute ownership, entirely of highly lucrative intellectual property. the highly famous Skyline Eco House, and the highly celebrated Vidian Tower. Exactly those are officially your highly massive flagship projects. Absolutely correct? Absolutely, 100% correct, Julian brilliantly beamed. My absolute pure masterpieces. Incredibly funny, Arthur stated. Because absolutely according completely to the highly complex metadata, entirely in the highly original authentic KAD files, and the highly sworn witness testimonies, entirely of a highly officially registered notary. The highly lucrative copyrights, completely to exactly, those highly massive projects, highly legally, belong completely to Vanguard or Vorontsova. Julian deeply frowned. Vanguard? No! Victoria absolutely used to highly pathetically help me completely with the highly complex programs. She highly, simply, highly pathetically put her highly beautiful name exactly when highly actively logging completely in. She is absolutely just a highly pathetic housewife. She profoundly knows absolutely nothing entirely about highly complex architecture. Is exactly that so? The beautiful voice loudly resonated completely from the absolute far end entirely of the massive table. The highly expensive leather chair incredibly slowly, smoothly turned completely around. The sharp jaw entirely of Julian, completely, violently dropped. His highly brilliant brain highly aggressively refused to highly successfully process the highly terrifying picture perfectly in front, entirely of him. In the highly coveted chairman's chair, safely sat Victoria. But exactly, this absolutely was not the highly pathetic, submissive Victoria that he intimately knew. This highly terrifying woman flawlessly wore a highly bespoke, immaculate white power suit that highly aggressively radiated absolute authority. Her beautiful hair, absolutely usually highly messily gathered entirely in a highly careless bun, was exactly now incredibly sleek and highly perfectly straight. On her delicate neck, brilliantly sparkled highly expensive diamonds, highly authentic, massive exactly ones. Her piercing eyes were incredibly sharp, completely, utterly devoid, entirely of the highly warm warmth that he had highly toxically taken, completely for highly granted, and entirely for exactly 3 agonizing years. Hello, Julian, she stated incredibly freezing coldly. Victoria! Julian violently stammered, frantically standing completely up. What? What exactly are you highly actively doing perfectly here? How exactly did you highly successfully get completely in perfectly here? Elite security! He frantically looked completely around the massive table, highly desperately searching entirely for highly pathetic help. But the highly elite members entirely of the massive board simply intensely stared directly at him completely, with a highly toxic mixture, entirely of pathetic pity and highly mocking derision. Safely sit completely down, Julian, Victoria violently commanded. The highly absolute authority entirely in her beautiful voice violently snapped exactly like a highly sharp whip. The weak knees entirely of Julian completely, violently buckled. He sat heavily down. I absolutely do not completely understand. Are you officially a highly pathetic secretary? Secretary. Victoria highly loudly let completely out a highly dry, completely joyless, pure laugh. I highly legally own exactly this massive building, Julian. I highly legally own the massive table perfectly at which you are highly pathetically sitting. I highly legally own the massive bank entirely in which your highly pathetic mortgage officially is. I am officially Victoria Vanguard, or Vorontsova, the highly absolute majority shareholder and the highly absolute chairman. Entirely of the highly elite board of directors, entirely of Vanguard Holdings. No, Julian whispered incredibly softly. You are absolutely just Vicky. You are completely broke. You highly pathetically washed the highly massive floors. I highly pathetically washed the highly massive floors entirely because I highly genuinely fiercely wanted to miraculously build a highly beautiful life completely with you, Victoria stated, smoothly leaning significantly closer. I highly genuinely fiercely wanted to absolutely be fiercely loved entirely for exactly who I truly am. Absolutely not entirely for my massive money. I highly secretly hid my highly massive identity entirely to successfully discover exactly if you were officially a true man, entirely of highly absolute word and pure honor. She violently paused, her piercing eyes completely, violently narrowing. You completely, catastrophically failed the highly absolute test. But the highly anticipated merger, Julian heavily breathed, highly desperately attempting to miraculously save the absolute only highly massive thing that he completely understood. The highly massive $4 billion deal. There absolutely is no highly massive deal, Victoria stated, smoothly picking completely from the massive table, a highly official document. The highly massive contract that he had confidently come entirely to highly proudly sign. She completely, violently, tore it, completely, in highly perfect half. The highly sharp sound violently cut completely through the highly dead silence entirely of the massive room. I absolutely did not highly politely call you directly here, entirely to highly expensively buy your highly pathetic company, Julian. I highly explicitly called you directly here entirely to completely, violently bury it. Arthur highly smoothly pushed completely across the massive table, a highly brand new official document. This is officially a highly strict cease and desist demand, Arthur explicitly explained. We are highly aggressively legally suing Sterling Architecture entirely for highly illegal theft, entirely of highly lucrative intellectual property. We officially possess highly undeniable evidence that Victoria highly actively designed absolutely all your highly key massive projects. We are absolutely also completely, violently, freezing absolutely all your highly secure assets, completely pending the highly strict conclusion entirely of a highly thorough investigation, entirely into highly illegal misappropriation entirely of corporate funds. Highly particularly, the highly illegal use entirely of highly secure company accounts, entirely to highly illegally finance the highly glamorous lifestyle entirely of a highly pathetic mistress. You absolutely cannot highly possibly actively do exactly this, Julian loudly screamed, his handsome face completely, violently paling. We are highly legally married. It is officially highly joint marital property. You highly eagerly signed the highly brutal divorce papers exactly on highly anticipated Friday. Remember? Victoria highly coldly reminded him, highly proudly raising the highly officially signed decree. And you highly explicitly, voluntarily, highly formally waived the highly absolute right entirely to highly official disclosure entirely of my highly massive assets entirely in highly direct exchange, entirely for me, absolutely not highly aggressively demanding highly massive alimony. You highly desperately wanted entirely to completely, violently sever the highly complex relationship completely cleanly. Deeply remember, you highly successfully got exactly it. Julian physically felt exactly as if the massive room completely, violently, spun. He deeply thought entirely about Chloe, highly anxiously waiting completely for him, entirely in the highly expensive restaurant. He deeply thought entirely about his highly arrogant mother, highly toxically boasting completely on her expensive phone. "Victoria, please," Julian highly pathetically pleaded completely with a violently breaking pathetic voice. "We can highly amicably discuss exactly this. I absolutely, still, fiercely love you." Chloe explicitly meant absolutely nothing. It was absolutely just highly massive stress. "I will highly ruthlessly dump her. I will safely return. We can highly successfully manage exactly this completely together. Just highly vividly imagine exactly what we could highly possibly successfully do. The highly massive empire entirely of Vanguard and Sterling." Victoria intensely looked directly at him completely, with highly undisguised, absolute disgust. "There absolutely is no highly massive Sterling empire, Julian. Perfectly there is absolutely only a highly pathetic shell company, highly illegally managed completely by a highly pathetic fraud." She highly aggressively pressed a highly secure button perfectly on the highly advanced intercom. "Elite security. Highly aggressively escort Mr. Sterling completely out and violently take his highly cheap visitor badge. He is completely, permanently, highly legally denied. Highly absolute access completely to absolutely all Vanguard properties, flawlessly including the highly pathetic parking lot." "Victoria!" Julian loudly screamed exactly as exactly two highly massive, imposing security guards highly aggressively lifted him completely by his weak arms. "You absolutely cannot highly actively do exactly this completely to me. My highly powerful mother will completely violently destroy you. Highly politely say hello completely to Eleanor, entirely for me." Victoria loudly called out, exactly as he was highly humiliatingly dragged directly toward the heavy door. "And highly explicitly, tell her entirely to highly urgently check her highly secure email. I highly accurately assume she literally just completely, violently lost the highly expensive venue entirely for her highly exclusive gala event." As the heavy door violently slammed completely shut, Victoria highly smoothly let completely out a highly long, profound exhalation. She intensely looked completely around at the highly elite members, entirely of the massive board, peacefully sitting entirely at the massive table. "My highly profound apologies entirely for exactly this highly dramatic family scene," she stated, highly meticulously adjusting her highly expensive bespoke jacket. "And exactly now, shall we highly actively discuss the highly massive acquisition entirely of exactly that highly authentic architectural firm we had absolutely been highly keenly eyeing. The highly exclusive London exactly one?" "Agreed, Madam Chairman," the massive board highly respectfully murmured. But Victoria profoundly knew that exactly this was absolutely only the absolute first highly massive domino. Julian was completely, violently broken, but he was completely desperate. And Eleanor was a highly toxic viper who would absolutely not highly cowardly give completely up completely without violently spitting her highly lethal venom. The highly massive war had absolutely only highly actively begun. Interactive question. Victoria just revealed her true identity and destroyed Julian's company. Do you think Julian will try to fight back, or is he completely defeated? Drop your predictions below. Part 4. The House of Cards collapses. Julian Sterling visually looked absolutely nothing, exactly like a highly brilliant rising star. Entirely of elite architecture, exactly when he highly humiliatingly tumbled completely through the highly grand front door. Entirely of the highly massive mansion, entirely of his highly arrogant mother. He visually looked exactly like a highly pathetic man who had absolutely been highly brutally dragged completely through a highly violent hurricane. His highly expensive, bespoke Italian suit was completely soaking wet, completely from the freezing rain. His highly expensive car had absolutely been completely, violently, towed directly to the highly secure impound lot. The absolute precise moment he confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly massive Vanguard Tower. And his piercing eyes were completely, violently wide open, completely, with a highly manic, terrifying energy, completely full, entirely, of absolute horror. Where exactly is the highly massive check? Eleanor absolutely didn't even actively tear her piercing gaze completely off her highly advanced tablet, exactly when he confidently entered the massive living room. She was highly frantically actively typing highly urgent emails, highly desperately attempting to miraculously save the highly expensive venue entirely of her highly exclusive gala event. And exactly why are you completely soaking wet? Have you absolutely already highly pathetically sold the expensive car? Chloe was highly comfortably sprawled, completely on the highly expensive chaise lounge, highly happily eating delicious grapes. Did you highly successfully get your highly massive $4 billion, my beautiful baby? I vividly saw entirely in the highly exclusive boutique a highly stunning diamond ring that would visually look completely, utterly, perfectly on my delicate little finger. Julian fell heavily directly onto his weak knees perfectly on the highly expensive Persian rug. He highly loudly let completely out a highly disturbing sound that actively sounded exactly like a highly hysterical laugh, and exactly like a highly tragic sob. There is absolutely no massive money, he highly hoarsely wheezed. There absolutely is no highly massive deal. Chloe violently sat completely up, the delicious grapes highly carelessly scattering completely from her fragile lap. What exactly do you explicitly mean perfectly? There is absolutely no massive deal. You highly arrogantly explicitly told me it was completely entirely in the highly secure bag. It is officially her, Julian whispered incredibly softly, intensely staring directly at the hard floor. Victoria. She is officially the absolute chairman. Eleanor finally slowly looked completely up. Her absolutely usually highly cold and highly calculating piercing gaze completely, violently narrowed entirely in massive confusion. Actively speak highly clearly, Julian. You are highly pathetically babbling. Victoria! It is officially Victoria Vanguard! Julian loudly screamed completely with a violently breaking, pathetic voice. She highly legally owns the highly massive Vanguard Group. She highly legally owns the highly massive tower. She highly legally owns absolutely everything. She is officially a highly terrifying billionaire mom, and we highly toxically treated her exactly like a highly pathetic maid. The highly heavy silence that violently followed was incredibly heavy and highly suffocating. Exactly that is completely medically impossible, Chloe highly toxically snorted. Exactly, although her toxic voice violently trembled incredibly slightly. She flawlessly wore highly cheap clothes completely from the highly pathetic mass market. She highly pathetically drove a highly pathetic 10-year-old Civic. She highly pathetically cooked you highly delicious dinner. It was an absolute, highly massive test. Julian highly aggressively grabbed his absolute own dark hair, highly violently tearing it completely out entirely by the highly deep roots. She highly desperately wanted to explicitly know exactly if I fiercely loved her, absolutely just entirely for her. And I completely, catastrophically failed it. I completely failed. And exactly now, she is completely violently destroying us. She completely canceled the highly anticipated merger. She is highly aggressively suing US entirely for highly illegal theft, entirely of highly lucrative intellectual property. She is completely, violently freezing the highly secure accounts. Eleanor incredibly slowly, confidently stood completely up. She confidently walked directly to her highly arrogant son, and completely without a single shadow, entirely of pathetic emotion, highly violently slapped him incredibly hard, completely across his pale face. The highly sharp sound loudly rang completely out, exactly like a highly lethal gunshot. Highly aggressively pull completely yourself completely together, Eleanor violently hissed. You are officially a highly elite sterling. We absolutely do not highly pathetically grovel. But she officially possesses highly massive billions, Julian highly pathetically whimpered, fiercely holding his bright red cheek. She can highly easily expensively buy and highly successfully sell US exactly a highly massive 1,000 times. Massive money is officially absolute power. Yes, Eleanor stated, frantically pacing the massive room, her brilliant brain highly feverishly actively working. But highly public perception is absolutely also absolute power. And right exactly now, absolutely no one profoundly knows entirely about exactly this, completely, except entirely, for us. She profoundly knows, Julian stated. The highly elite board of directors profoundly knows. The highly elite board of directors highly securely keeps their highly arrogant mouths completely shut. Eleanor highly dismissively waved completely off. They will absolutely only actively communicate completely with the highly aggressive press exactly when the highly expensive lawyers highly officially give the highly absolute green light. We officially possess a highly fragile window. A highly fragile window entirely for exactly what? Chloe sharply asked, frantically looking completely from exactly one directly to the absolute other. If she is highly genuinely truly a highly terrifying billionaire, I am completely, violently bailing. I absolutely did not highly happily sign completely up entirely for highly pathetic poverty. You absolutely stand completely perfectly still, you highly pathetic, stupid little fool, Eleanor violently snapped. You are highly actively carrying the highly coveted heir entirely of the highly elite sterlings. Exactly that is officially our highly massive leverage. Eleanor confidently walked directly to the massive window, intensely watching exactly as the freezing rain violently lashed completely against the highly thick glass. Victoria may highly successfully possess massive money, but entirely for the absolute last 3 agonizing years, she has highly pathetically played the highly pathetic role entirely of a highly pathetic, miserable housewife. She officially possesses absolutely no highly public profile, absolutely no highly elite social capital. To the absolute entire massive world, she is officially an absolute nobody. And exactly so? Julian softly asked. So, Eleanor smoothly turned completely around. A highly cruel, toxic smile violently twisting her soft lips. We are actively going to highly aggressively control the highly public narrative. We will highly aggressively strike, absolutely first. We will confidently go directly to the highly aggressive press. We will highly toxically explicitly tell them that Victoria is a highly mentally unstable, pathetic woman, highly actively suffering completely from highly toxic delusions. We will highly explicitly tell them that she highly maliciously sabotaged your highly massive company completely out, entirely, of highly toxic spite. Entirely. Because you highly ruthlessly dumped her. We will highly maliciously paint her exactly as the highly toxic villain, completely before she absolutely even highly successfully has the highly absolute time, entirely, to confidently step completely out, directly into the highly bright light. She will highly aggressively legally sue us entirely for highly toxic defamation, Julian stated. Let her highly happily do it. Eleanor highly dismissively waved. Highly complex legal proceedings, highly agonizingly last entirely for agonizing years. By the absolute time, the absolute truth finally completely comes completely out. Your highly pristine reputation will absolutely be miraculously saved. And we will highly successfully find highly brand new elite investors who will highly pathetically pity the highly poor, pathetic guy who miraculously became the highly tragic target entirely of his highly crazy, toxic ex-wife. We will completely, violently transform her highly massive billions completely into her highly absolute weakness. We will highly publicly claim that she highly maliciously used the massive money entirely of her highly powerful family, entirely to highly cruelly bully the highly innocent owner, entirely of a highly small business. Exactly, that is highly diabolically cunning, Chloe stated. And a highly slow, toxic smile beautifully spread completely across her beautiful face. I absolutely love exactly it. I can highly easily violently cry completely for the highly aggressive cameras. I am incredibly, highly good, entirely at violently crying. Excellent, Eleanor stated. The highly exclusive gala is completely, violently cancelled. But the highly aggressive press is absolutely, still highly, desperately thirsty, entirely, for highly explosive sensations. Tomorrow evening, we will highly proudly host a highly exclusive dinner of absolute truth. Perfectly right, perfectly here, entirely in the massive mansion. We will highly officially invite the highly prominent leading journalists and the highly absolute elite entirely of the massive city. We will completely, violently expose Victoria exactly as a highly pathetic fraud, completely, before she absolutely, even highly successfully manages entirely to highly publicly execute us in exactly that highly specific moment. The bright lights entirely in the massive house violently flickered and completely, violently, went completely out. The highly soft humming entirely of the massive refrigerator, entirely in the highly expensive kitchen, highly abruptly cut completely off. The highly massive mansion, completely, violently, plunged completely into pitch-black darkness. "What exactly now?" Chloe loudly shrieked. Julian highly frantically fumbled entirely for his expensive phone. The bright screen brilliantly illuminated his pale face. It is officially a highly secure message completely from the highly massive energy supply company. Highly official service has absolutely been completely suspended, entirely at the highly strict request entirely of the absolute owner, entirely of the highly massive property. We are officially the highly absolute owners entirely of exactly this highly massive property, Eleanor violently growled. No, Julian stated, highly rapidly scrolling completely down the highly secure message. The highly massive mortgage, the highly aggressive bank, highly legally sold the highly massive mortgage exactly this highly busy afternoon directly to a highly massive holding company, Vanguard Holdings. Eleanor completely, profoundly understood absolutely everything. Her deep voice completely fell directly to a highly terrifying whisper. She highly legally bought the massive house. She completely, violently, turned completely off the highly massive electricity. Eleanor stood perfectly entirely in the pitch-black darkness, fiercely clenching her soft hands completely into highly tight fists. She highly fiercely wants to highly actively play entirely in the highly dirty mud. Highly perfect. I was highly proudly born entirely in the highly dirty mud. She smoothly turned directly toward the dark silhouette entirely of her arrogant son, actively starting the highly massive backup generator. Julian, highly urgently call the highly sleazy tabloid newspapers. Highly explicitly tell them that we officially possess a highly explosive story that will completely, violently shake the massive city. The highly secret toxic life entirely of the highly pathetic wife, entirely of a billionaire. We will completely, violently burn her completely back directly to the highly cold ash. Eleanor is planning to smear Victoria in the press. Do you think her toxic plan will work, or will Victoria crush it? Tell us your thoughts below. Part 5. The final checkmate. The highly massive backup generator loudly roared entirely in the massive backyard, highly aggressively powering the highly bright floodlights that brilliantly illuminated the highly massive Sterling mansion. It was a highly pathetic beacon entirely of absolute desperation, entirely in the highly dark, elite neighborhood. Eleanor had highly aggressively used absolutely all her highly remaining elite connections and highly massive favors. A highly elite catering service was highly rapidly setting the highly expensive tables entirely in the highly grand ballroom. The absolute best highly expensive champagne, highly illegally bought, completely on highly maxed out credit cards, that officially possessed absolutely only highly counted short hours, completely left, completely until highly absolute blocking, heavily flowed exactly like a highly massive river. The highly massive hall was completely, utterly packed. Highly aggressive reporters, completely from the absolute largest city newspapers. Highly influential bloggers, highly actively writing entirely about highly elite gossip. And the highly absolute social elite, highly astutely smelling the highly intoxicating scent entirely of highly fresh blood, were absolutely all perfectly here. They absolutely did not confidently come directly here entirely to highly warmly support the highly arrogant Sterlings. They confidently came directly here entirely for the highly dramatic spectacle. Eleanor confidently stood perfectly on a highly elevated dais, entirely in the absolute front, entirely of the massive hall, flawlessly wearing a highly stunning silver designer dress that visually looked exactly like highly impenetrable armor. Julian confidently stood perfectly to her absolute right, completely, with a highly solemn, tragic look. Chloe peacefully sat perfectly on a highly comfortable chair directly to her absolute left, fiercely holding a highly expensive lace handkerchief and visually looking highly demonstratively, pathetically, tragic. Highly esteemed ladies and highly powerful gentlemen, Eleanor confidently began, her deep voice highly flawlessly amplified completely by the highly active microphone. Thank you so incredibly much entirely for confidently coming entirely on exactly such highly incredibly short notice. Exactly today, we have highly officially gathered perfectly here, entirely, to completely, violently refute the highly malicious rumors, highly actively circulating completely around Sterling architecture, and the highly recent toxic attacks completely on our highly noble family. The highly blinding cameras violently flashed incredibly brightly. My highly beloved son, Julian, Eleanor aggressively continued, gently placing a highly loving hand perfectly on his broad shoulder, has highly tragically become the highly innocent victim entirely of a highly meticulously planned toxic campaign, entirely of highly illegal corporate sabotage. And the highly malicious culprit is absolutely no one, completely else but his highly vengeful ex-wife, Victoria. A highly loud, massive murmur violently swept completely through the highly curious crowd. Victoria. Julian confidently took exactly one massive step, completely forward. His deep voice was highly meticulously rehearsed and incredibly gloomy. She was absolutely the beautiful woman that I fiercely loved. But she officially possessed highly severe problems completely, with the highly adequate perception entirely of absolute reality. When I highly honestly, explicitly told her that I was highly actively leaving, she completely, violently snapped. She highly maliciously used the highly hidden, massive fortune entirely of her highly powerful family. A highly massive wealth entirely about which she highly maliciously lied entirely for agonizing years. To highly illegally buy completely up my highly massive debts. Highly illegally hack my highly secure systems. And highly desperately attempt entirely to highly ruthlessly deprive me entirely of my highly absolute livelihood. She is a highly vengeful, highly mentally unstable, pathetic woman who highly maliciously uses her massive money entirely to completely, violently silence the absolute truth. She absolutely even highly maliciously turned completely off the highly massive electricity entirely in our massive home. She is highly desperately attempting entirely to completely, violently kill my innocent baby completely with highly massive stress. Chloe loudly sobbed directly into the active microphone. The highly aggressive reporters highly furiously actively wrote entirely in their highly thick notepads. It was a highly spicy, highly lucrative angle. The highly evil, toxic, secret billionaire completely against the highly hard-working, innocent family. We will absolutely not highly generously allow completely ourselves entirely to absolutely be highly maliciously intimidated, Eleanor loudly screamed, highly proudly raising her clenched fist. We will highly bravely stand completely for highly absolute. The highly heavy double doors, entirely in the absolute back entirely of the highly grand ballroom, absolutely didn't entirely just smoothly open. They completely, violently burst completely wide open. The massive room completely, violently fell entirely into a highly deafening silence. In the highly imposing doorway, confidently stood absolutely not a highly massive security guard. And absolutely not the highly elite police. It was officially Victoria. She flawlessly wore a highly stunning designer dress, entirely of highly deep navy blue velvet, that highly actively seemed to completely, violently absorb the highly bright light. She confidently stepped completely, with a highly terrifying grace that completely, violently horrified Julian. Heavily flanked completely by her sides, confidently walked exactly 4 highly imposing massive men. Arthur. Exactly 2 highly terrifying elite lawyers, completely with highly thick leather briefcases, and a highly unknown, massive man, completely to Julian, fiercely holding a highly advanced laptop, securely in his strong hands. I highly absolutely hate entirely to violently interrupt the highly dramatic reading entirely of highly excellent, pathetic fiction. The beautiful voice entirely of Victoria loudly resonated. She absolutely did not desperately need a highly active microphone. Her highly flawless diction was completely, utterly impeccable. But I highly fiercely prefer absolute nonfiction. Get the hell completely out! Eleanor violently screamed, completely, violently losing her highly calculated composure. Exactly this is officially highly private property. Elite security. In highly absolute fact, Victoria stated. Highly smoothly continuing entirely to incredibly slowly, confidently walk directly toward the massive stage entirely, while the highly massive crowd highly rapidly parted perfectly before her, exactly like the highly famous Red Sea. As entirely of exactly 4 p.m., exactly today. Exactly, this is officially my highly private property. The highly strict foreclosure completely on the highly massive property was highly aggressively accelerated, entirely due, completely, to highly undeniable evidence, entirely of highly fraudulent, illegal activities, entirely during the highly official processing, entirely of the highly massive mortgage. She completely stopped perfectly at the absolute foot entirely of the massive stage, intensely looking directly at the highly toxic trinity. The highly aggressive cameras completely, violently, turned completely away completely from Eleanor and completely, utterly focused highly exclusively completely on Victoria. You highly proudly actively speak entirely about the absolute truth, Eleanor, Victoria stated. Let's highly generously share exactly it. She highly smoothly gave a highly slight sign completely to the massive man, completely with the advanced laptop. He highly rapidly connected a highly secure cable directly to the highly advanced projection system entirely of the highly grand ballroom. The highly enormous screen completely behind Eleanor, completely on which highly proudly flaunted the highly aristocratic coat of arms entirely of the highly elite Sterling family, violently blinked. Turn exactly that completely off. Julian frantically rushed directly toward the highly secure cable, but Arthur completely, violently blocked his highly frantic path. Arthur absolutely was not highly young, but he smoothly moved completely with the highly terrifying speed entirely of a highly experienced elite soldier. He highly aggressively intercepted the weak wrist entirely of Julian, and completely, violently twisted his weak arm completely behind his fragile back, highly brutally forcing him to heavily drop directly onto his weak knees. Intensely watch, Victoria violently commanded. The highly massive screen brilliantly lit completely up. It absolutely was not a highly boring electronic spreadsheet. It was officially a highly clear video. It was officially a highly secure recording completely from a highly hidden CCTV camera, completely from a highly exclusive hotel bar. Highly official timestamp, exactly 6 agonizing months completely ago. On exactly, it were, highly clearly Julian and Chloe, peacefully sitting entirely in a highly cozy booth. The highly clear audio perfectly here is officially the absolute best, highly massive part, Victoria highly smoothly noted. The highly clear audio violently played completely with the highly clear video. Julian, exactly when are you actively going to highly ruthlessly dump exactly that highly pathetic maid? Chloe highly drunkenly drawled. Incredibly soon, the highly recognizable voice entirely of Julian replied. I absolutely only highly desperately need her to highly successfully finish the highly complex KAD blueprints entirely for the highly massive Skyline project. I absolutely cannot highly possibly calculate the highly complex load-bearing walls. As incredibly soon, exactly as she highly successfully finishes the highly exhausting work, I will highly proudly put my highly official signature, highly expensively sell exactly it, and highly ruthlessly throw her completely out. And the massive money I have absolutely already highly illegally transferred. The highly elite client highly officially transferred the highly massive deposit directly to a highly secure offshore account, entirely in highly exclusive Cyprus. Victoria highly pathetically, genuinely thinks the highly pathetic firm is completely broke. She highly pathetically pays the highly expensive electricity bills completely out. Entirely of her highly pathetic savings entirely, while I highly expensively buy you exactly this highly expensive necklace. The highly massive crowd highly loudly gasped. The highly blinding flashes entirely of the expensive cameras went completely, violently insane. Julian, absolutely still highly brutally pinned completely by Arthur, completely, violently went completely limp. Exactly that is Diego. Exactly that is a highly malicious deepfake. Eleanor highly frantically shrieked. Highly illegal technological pathetic tricks. Is exactly that highly officially so? Victoria softly asked. Then let's highly meticulously look entirely at the highly secure bank transfers. The highly massive screen completely, violently changed. On exactly, it confidently appeared a highly clear block diagram, flawlessly showing the highly illegal movement entirely of highly massive cash funds. Completely from sterling architecture, directly to a highly secure account, highly explicitly named Eleanor Gala Fund. And directly to absolutely another highly explicitly named Chloe Personal Needs. Massive embezzlement, Victoria highly clinically commented. Highly illegal tax evasion and highly massive theft, entirely in highly particularly massive proportions. You were highly illegally stealing completely from your absolute own massive company, Julian, and highly maliciously hiding exactly it completely from the highly strict tax authorities. And you, Eleanor, you highly illegally used the highly massive client advances entirely to highly expensively pay entirely for your highly glamorous social life. Absolute lies! Eleanor highly aggressively grabbed the highly heavy microphone stand, highly violently swinging exactly like a highly lethal weapon. You highly illegally hacked our highly secure accounts. Exactly that is completely, utterly illegal. A highly strict forensic accounting audit, Victoria highly smoothly corrected. Completely, 100% legal, exactly when you are officially the highly absolute majority creditor. She smoothly shifted her piercing gaze completely to Chloe. Chloe, completely, violently, coward. Highly frantically attempting to highly cowardly hide completely behind her comfortable chair. And exactly now, the highly anticipated highlight entirely of the massive program, Victoria stated incredibly softly. The highly coveted heir. Please absolutely do not, Chloe whispered incredibly softly. Her beautiful face completely, violently paled. You highly arrogantly claimed that you were heavily pregnant completely with the highly coveted heir entirely of the highly elite Sterlings, Victoria stated. A highly handsome boy. Absolutely isn't exactly that highly officially correct? The highly massive screen completely, violently changed completely anew. It was officially a highly official medical report. This is officially a highly official report, completely from the highly elite clinic, entirely of Dr. Smirnov, Victoria highly clearly read. Highly officially dated exactly 2 short weeks completely prior. Highly official patient, Chloe. Highly official diagnosis, severe gastritis. Highly official pregnancy test, completely negative. The highly massive hall completely, violently exploded. Loud laughter, massive shock, and highly intrusive questions violently hung completely in the heavy air. She is absolutely not heavily pregnant? Julian slowly looked completely up. Highly toxic betrayal, violently fighting completely with absolute catastrophic collapse, entirely in his piercing gaze. Julian, I highly genuinely thought I was heavily pregnant, Chloe highly pathetically babbled. The highly cheap test was completely catastrophically flawed. You highly maliciously lied, Julian violently roared, highly aggressively resisting the highly brutal grip entirely of Arthur. You highly toxically, explicitly told me that we highly desperately needed a highly expensive nursery. I highly expensively bought you a highly expensive car, entirely because completely of the innocent baby. And who exactly is officially the true father, entirely of exactly this highly imaginary innocent baby? Victoria asked, highly smoothly giving the highly subtle sign entirely for the absolute next highly massive slide. It was officially a highly clear photograph, entirely of Chloe, completely, with absolutely another man. A highly famous, wealthy owner entirely of a highly exclusive local nightclub, highly explicitly taken exactly 3 short days, completely prior. They were entirely in a highly, incredibly intimate setting. It highly apparently seems that Chloe was highly actively hedging her highly pathetic bets, Victoria stated. Chloe violently burst completely into highly dramatic tears and frantically fled completely off the massive stage, highly aggressively, violently pushing her highly desperate way completely through the highly massive crowd, entirely of highly aggressive reporters who highly aggressively shoved their highly intrusive microphones completely into her pale face. Victoria confidently climbed the highly steep steps directly onto the massive stage. She confidently stood perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to Eleanor, who was violently trembling completely from a highly explosive mixture, entirely of pure rage and absolute terror. You highly fiercely wanted a highly public dramatic spectacle, Eleanor, Victoria stated, violently lowering her deep voice entirely so exactly that absolutely only the highly arrogant matriarch could highly clearly hear. You highly desperately wanted to highly proudly show the entire massive world exactly who I truly, genuinely am. Well, exactly now they profoundly know, and they absolutely also profoundly know exactly who you truly are. Victoria smoothly turned completely toward the active microphone. I am officially Victoria Vanguard, and I am completely, permanently closing Sterling architecture. From exactly this highly specific moment, the highly massive assets will absolutely be completely liquidated, entirely to highly, fairly pay, absolute compensation completely to the highly innocent clients whom my highly toxic ex-husband highly maliciously defrauded. As entirely for exactly this highly massive house. She intensely looked completely around the highly luxurious grand ballroom. It will absolutely be completely, beautifully transformed, completely into a highly secure shelter entirely for beautiful women, highly toxically subjected, completely to highly severe financial abuse completely by their highly toxic partners. In my highly personal opinion, exactly that is incredibly poetic. Don't you highly genuinely agree? You absolutely cannot, Eleanor whispered incredibly softly. Where exactly will I highly possibly go? Victoria intensely looked directly at her. Truly, genuinely, intensely looked directly at her entirely for the absolute last, highly specific time. I highly clearly heard that the highly pathetic Honda Civic is absolutely still, peacefully parked perfectly at the highly quiet intersection entirely of Lexington and 5th, or Lenin and Sadovaya. It officially possesses a highly full, massive tank entirely of cheap gas. I highly strongly advise you entirely to safely reach exactly it completely before it is completely, violently towed. Victoria highly aggressively dropped the heavy microphone. It violently hit the hard floor completely with a highly loud thud that highly officially marked the absolute, permanent end entirely of the highly arrogant Sterling dynasty. She confidently stepped completely off the massive stage, smoothly passing the highly blinding flashes entirely of the expensive cameras, smoothly passing the completely, utterly destroyed Julian, and confidently walked completely out the heavy door. She absolutely did not actively look completely back. The highly pathetic dead weight had finally completely been unhooked, and completely without her, the highly arrogant Sterling simply completely, violently went directly to the absolute bottom. Victoria exposed everything at the gala and took their house. Was this the ultimate revenge? What was your favorite moment? Tell us below. Part 6. The Price of Arrogance. The highly sharp sound entirely of a highly heavy, slamming prison cell door is completely, utterly unmistakable. It is a highly heavy metal fatality, violently resonating completely in the fragile bones. For Julian Sterling, it was officially the absolute loudest, highly terrifying sound that he had absolutely ever clearly heard. He sat peacefully, entirely, on a highly thin, moth-eaten cheap mattress, entirely in the highly secure, temporary detention facility. His highly expensive Italian suit, exactly once actively being his highly impenetrable armor, was exactly now completely crumpled and completely soaked entirely in cold sweat. His highly expensive tie had absolutely been highly officially confiscated. A highly strict precaution completely against highly tragic suicide that physically felt highly humiliatingly necessary. "Sterling!" the massive guard loudly barked, highly aggressively banging his heavy baton completely against the iron bars. "The elite lawyer is perfectly here. You officially possess exactly 5 short minutes." Julian violently jumped completely up. In his fragile chest brilliantly flared highly pure hope. My highly powerful mother highly successfully found a highly brilliant way, he highly desperately thought. She highly urgently called the highly powerful senator. She highly successfully fixed absolutely everything. He was highly roughly led directly into a highly small, highly depressing room, completely with a highly scratched plexiglass partition. But perfectly on the absolute other highly distant side sat absolutely not a highly influential, expensive lawyer. It was officially a highly pathetic public defender, a highly tired, exhausted man, explicitly named Mr. Gorski, completely with highly visible coffee stains, perfectly on his cheap shirt, and a highly massive stack entirely of highly complex folders that visibly seemed way too incredibly heavy, entirely for him. "Where exactly is Thorne?" Julian sharply asked, highly specifically referring completely to the highly permanent, elite lawyer entirely of the massive family. "Where exactly is my highly powerful mother?" Mr. Gorski heavily sighed incredibly deeply, smoothly opening the highly thick folder. Mr. Thorne highly officially recused completely himself. Absolutely something entirely about highly massive unpaid elite fees and a highly massive conflict entirely of interest, highly specifically related, completely to the highly massive Vanguard group. And exactly as entirely for your highly arrogant mother, she is currently highly actively being highly officially processed entirely in the highly secure women's block. "Processed?" Julian highly pathetically squeaked. "Highly illegal tax fraud, Mr. Sterling. Highly illegal wire fraud. Highly illegal conspiracy, entirely to highly maliciously commit massive embezzlement. The highly ruthless district attorney highly actively intends entirely to completely, violently, put absolutely, both entirely of you, safely away, completely, for the highly absolute maximum massive term. The highly undeniable evidence highly officially provided completely by the highly strict forensic accounting audit is completely, utterly, exhaustive. But I absolutely did not completely know, Julian highly pathetically pleaded, fiercely pressing completely himself, completely against the highly scratched glass. They were absolutely just highly simple accounting mistakes. I am officially a highly brilliant architect, absolutely not a highly boring accountant. The highly secure emails highly clearly explicitly say completely otherwise, Gorski highly dryly retorted. Perfectly. There are highly secure correspondences entirely in which you highly explicitly actively instruct your highly arrogant mother entirely to highly illegally launder highly massive client deposits completely through her highly fake charity account entirely to highly maliciously hide highly massive assets completely from your highly devoted wife. Exactly. That is officially a highly severe criminal offense. In highly absolute fact, highly numerous, highly severe criminal offenses. Julian leaned heavily, completely back, entirely in his highly uncomfortable chair. Absolute bail. I highly desperately need massive bail. Absolute bail is highly officially set entirely at exactly $5 million, or 500 million rubles, Gorski stated. Highly explicitly considering the highly severe flight risk and the highly massive gravity entirely of the highly illegal financial crimes. Do you highly successfully possess exactly $5 million, Mr. Sterling? Julian fiercely grabbed his heavy head completely in his massive hands. Upon highly official arrest, perfectly in his highly expensive wallet, perfectly there were exactly $20, or 2,000 rubles. Meanwhile, perfectly on the absolute other highly distant side entirely of the massive city. Absolute reality completely, violently crashed, completely down, completely on Eleanor Sterling, completely with the highly massive force entirely of a highly destructive tidal wave. She had absolutely been highly conditionally released completely on her absolute own recognizance, entirely on highly strict medical grounds. A highly brilliantly faked, highly rapid heartbeat highly successfully gave her a highly few short, agonizing hours, entirely of highly fragile freedom, completely before highly official formal indictment. She stood perfectly entirely in the absolute center, entirely of exactly what absolutely used to absolutely be her highly massive living room. Highly massive movers, highly expensively hired, completely by the highly aggressive bank, brutally worked incredibly quickly. They were completely, violently stripping the massive house completely bare. The highly expensive paintings were completely gone. The highly expensive silver was completely gone. Absolutely, even the highly expensive Persian rugs were actively being highly efficiently rolled completely into highly tight tubes. Highly carefully, completely with exactly that, Eleanor highly violently yelled completely at a massive mover fiercely holding a highly expensive vase. Exactly that is officially a highly authentic Ming dynasty. It is officially highly official inventory, number 405. The massive mover violently grunted completely without actively looking entirely at her. Exactly now, exactly this, highly legally belongs completely to the highly aggressive creditors. Highly pathetic lady. Eleanor violently rushed completely out, entirely of the massive house, fiercely clutching her highly expensive designer handbag. Securely inside it, peacefully lay the absolute last, highly pathetic remnants entirely of her highly secret rainy day stash. A highly expensive, massive, diamond necklace that she had highly successfully hidden completely from the highly strict auditors. She highly desperately needed highly liquid cash. She highly desperately needed a highly expensive lawyer. She highly desperately needed to frantically flee directly to highly exclusive Cyprus. She highly frantically caught a highly cheap taxi. Her highly expensive Mercedes had absolutely already been highly officially confiscated, and violently ordered the highly confused driver entirely to highly rapidly drive directly to a highly elite, exclusive pawn shop entirely in the highly expensive jewelry district. "I highly desperately need a highly rapid appraisal," Eleanor violently demanded, highly aggressively throwing the highly expensive necklace completely onto the highly soft velvet counter. "And I highly desperately need highly liquid cash, incredibly quickly." The highly elite jeweler, a highly serious man, explicitly named Mr. Katz, who had intimately known the highly arrogant Sterlings entirely for agonizing years, highly carefully took the highly expensive necklace. He highly professionally inserted a highly specialized loop completely into his piercing eye and highly meticulously examined exactly it. He intensely looked directly at it entirely for exactly 5 short seconds. Then he smoothly removed the highly specialized loop and intensely looked directly at Eleanor. "I can highly generously give you exactly $200, or 20,000 rubles, entirely for the highly simple setting," Katz stated. "The highly simple gold is completely authentic, exactly 14 carats." "Exactly $200 Eleanor loudly gasped. "Are you completely out entirely of your highly pathetic mind?" "Exactly. These are highly authentic diamonds entirely of the absolute highest highly pristine clarity. The highly expensive necklace is highly officially insured entirely for exactly $5 million. They absolutely were highly authentic diamonds," Katz highly gently corrected. "Exactly 10 agonizing years completely ago. But the highly cheap stones that are perfectly here, right exactly now, are officially highly cheap cubic zirconia, highly high-quality pathetic glass." "Exactly that is completely medically impossible," Eleanor whispered incredibly softly. "It highly safely, peacefully lay intactly in my highly secure private safe." She completely violently cut completely off. The hot blood completely violently froze entirely in her weak veins. Exactly 6 agonizing months completely ago, Julian had highly casually taken the highly secure key completely from her highly secure safe. He highly toxically explicitly said that he highly desperately needed to highly safely take the highly expensive watch entirely of his highly respected grandfather. Entirely to highly generously give exactly it entirely to highly professional cleaning, Julian. He had completely, violently swapped the highly expensive diamonds. He had highly illegally robbed his absolute own highly arrogant mother entirely to highly expensively pay entirely for the highly glamorous lifestyle, entirely of his highly pathetic mistress. Eleanor heavily leaned completely against the highly polished counter, her weak legs completely, violently, buckling completely under her. The highly brutal betrayal absolutely did not confidently come completely from Victoria. Absolutely not completely from the entire massive world. It confidentially came completely from the highly arrogant son that she had highly meticulously sculpted completely in her absolute own highly toxic image and highly pathetic likeness. She had highly meticulously taught him entirely to absolutely be completely, utterly ruthless. to highly aggressively take exactly what he highly fiercely wanted. And he had highly ruthlessly taken completely from her. "Do you highly actively take the exactly $200? Katz incredibly softly asked. Eleanor intensely stared directly at the highly cheap fake diamonds. "Safely keep exactly it," she highly hoarsely croaked. She confidently walked completely out, entirely of the highly expensive store, directly onto the highly wet, freezing sidewalk. She successfully possessed absolutely no massive money, absolutely no massive home, absolutely no fake friends. Her expensive phone violently buzzed. It was officially a highly urgent notification, completely from a highly popular social network that she highly rarely ever actively used. Highly trending. The highly catastrophic fall, entirely, of the highly arrogant House of Sterling. She highly smoothly clicked completely on the highly popular link. It was officially a highly viral video, exactly where Chloe was highly dramatically giving a highly exclusive interview directly to a highly prominent news site. Chloe was violently crying completely, with highly fake, pathetic tears. Eleanor profoundly knew exactly it, and highly toxically claiming that she had highly tragically become the highly innocent victim entirely of the highly abusive toxic cult, entirely of the highly arrogant Sterling family. She was highly maliciously selling them completely out entirely for her highly pathetic 15 short minutes, entirely of highly toxic fame. Eleanor laughed loudly. It was a highly broken, incredibly disjointed, pathetic sound. She intensely looked completely down the highly busy street. Safely parked perfectly at the highly quiet intersection, entirely of Lexington and Fifth, or Lennon and Sadovaya. Exactly as Victoria had highly officially promised. Safely stood the highly rusty, pathetic Honda Civic. It was officially the absolute only highly pathetic thing that highly safely remained. Eleanor confidently walked directly to exactly it. She smoothly opened the highly rusty door. Her highly sensitive nose was completely, violently hit, completely by the highly stale smell, entirely of highly cheap coffee and highly cheap vanilla. The highly simple smell, entirely of the highly quiet woman she had highly maliciously bullied entirely for exactly 3 agonizing years. She sat heavily completely down, entirely on the highly uncomfortable driver's seat. The highly weak engine violently started completely with highly massive difficulty. As she highly carefully merged completely into the highly heavy city traffic, flawlessly blending completely, incompletely, with the highly normal, simple people whom she had exactly once so incredibly highly toxically despised. Eleanor Sterling profoundly realized that she absolutely was not entirely just completely, violently ruined. She had completely, permanently become a highly pathetic relic entirely of the highly toxic past. Epilogue. The Phoenix rises. Exactly 1 beautiful year, completely later. The highly beautiful outline entirely of the massive city had completely, beautifully changed. Where exactly once highly proudly towered the highly abandoned, completely half-finished steel skeleton, entirely of the highly massive Sterling Tower, a highly arrogant monument completely to the highly toxic hubris, entirely of Julian. Exactly now flawlessly existed a highly beautiful public park, a highly lush community garden, and the highly magnificent Victoria Vanguard Art Center. It was a highly beautiful green oasis, perfectly in the absolute center, entirely of the highly concrete jungle. Beautifully teeming completely with highly happy families, highly talented artists, and highly vibrant, pure life. From her highly imposing executive office perfectly on the exactly 50th floor, entirely of the highly massive Vanguard building. Victoria peacefully watched the highly normal people completely down below. They visually looked exactly like highly tiny ants. But she absolutely did not profoundly feel absolutely any highly toxic superiority completely over them. She profoundly felt highly absolute connection. "Madam Chairman." Victoria smoothly turned completely around. In the heavy doorway confidently stood Arthur completely with a highly advanced tablet. He visually looked significantly healthier than entirely in highly agonizing previous years. The highly massive stress entirely of highly actively hiding the highly absolute identity entirely of Victoria had highly clearly weighed completely on him significantly, more highly heavily than he absolutely ever highly actively showed. Yes, Arthur. The highly official final report completely on the highly massive liquidation entirely of the highly toxic sterling assets, Arthur stated, gently placing the highly advanced tablet perfectly on her massive desk. "We have highly successfully completely paid, absolutely off, absolutely all highly legitimate creditors. Every single highly innocent contractor whom Julian highly maliciously screwed completely over has highly successfully received highly complete, absolute payouts, entirely and completely full. Absolutely all highly massive debts are completely, beautifully extinguished." "And the highly massive surplus?" Victoria softly asked. "Highly successfully transferred directly to the highly secure women's shelter. Exactly as highly officially instructed." Victoria nodded fiercely, highly smoothly taking her hot cup entirely of cheap tea. She confidently walked directly to the massive window. She absolutely did not desperately need entirely to highly explicitly name highly toxic names. Julian had highly cowardly, highly officially guilty entirely to highly desperately avoid an absolute 20-year massive sentence. Arthur had highly perfectly recited completely from his highly brilliant memory. He highly successfully received exactly 5 agonizing years, entirely in a highly strict penal colony. He is currently highly actively, brutally working entirely in the highly hot prison laundry. In exactly 2 agonizing years, he highly legally possesses highly fragile parole. But highly explicitly considering his highly toxic behavior, he highly apparently actively attempts entirely to highly toxically build highly fake connections completely with the massive guards. It is completely, utterly unlikely. And Eleanor, she is exactly now entirely in the absolute middle entirely of highly distant nowhere, perfectly near highly distant Ohio, or Ryazan, highly miserably managing a highly cheap, pathetic roadside motel, perfectly on the highly busy highway. It is absolutely by no means a highly exclusive 5-star elite establishment. Victoria highly smoothly took a highly small sip entirely of the hot tea. She had highly actively expected to profoundly feel a highly massive rush entirely of pure triumph, a highly explosive gust entirely of absolute justice. But she profoundly felt absolutely only a highly quiet, beautifully pacifying pure peace. The white-hot anger had incredibly long, completely burned, completely out, flawlessly leaving completely behind it highly fertile, beautiful ground, entirely for the highly magnificent growth, entirely of her absolute own, beautiful life. Exactly one significantly more highly massive thing, Arthur stated completely, with a highly bright twinkle entirely in his piercing eyes. The highly brilliant architect entirely for the highly anticipated London project, has highly successfully arrived. Mr. Alexander Blackwood. He is highly anxiously waiting entirely in highly exclusive conference room B. Victoria beautifully smiled. Alexander was completely, utterly brilliant, incredibly kind, and successfully possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that she was officially a highly terrifying billionaire exactly when they absolute first beautifully met, highly anonymously online, entirely on a highly exclusive design forum. He highly, simply, highly, genuinely loved her highly beautiful sketches. Highly politely, explicitly, tell him that I will absolutely be perfectly right, exactly there, Victoria stated. She highly casually checked her beautiful reflection entirely in the highly polished glass. The beautiful woman intensely looking directly back, completely at her. Absolutely was not a highly terrified, pathetic housewife, highly desperately actively attempting entirely to highly pathetically please a highly toxic narcissist. She absolutely was not a highly vengeful, toxic ex-wife, highly maliciously thirsty entirely for highly pathetic blood. She was officially Victoria Vanguard. She was incredibly strong. She was completely, utterly free. She confidently walked completely out entirely of the massive office. The highly expensive heels entirely of her designer shoes, flawlessly beating a highly confident rhythm entirely of absolute progress, completely across the highly polished marble floor, down completely below, entirely in the highly massive lobby. A highly curious tour group was highly peacefully passing completely by. The highly enthusiastic tour guide was highly proudly pointing directly at a highly massive, beautiful portrait entirely of Victoria that exactly now highly proudly hung completely behind the highly imposing reception desk. And exactly this, the highly enthusiastic tour guide highly proudly stated, is officially Victoria Vanguard, exactly last beautiful year. She highly successfully took complete, absolute control entirely of the massive company and completely, violently tripled its highly massive charitable contributions. She is highly explicitly famous entirely for her highly beautiful personal philosophy. Highly true, absolute value, absolutely does not flawlessly lie entirely in exactly what you highly legally own, but entirely in exactly who you truly are. In the highly distant tale entirely of the highly curious tour group, highly violently lingered a highly tired young woman flawlessly wearing a highly faded, cheap coat. It was officially Chloe. She visually looked significantly older, significantly harsher. She fiercely held entirely in her fragile arms an innocent baby. Exactly this highly specific time, a highly real, exactly one. Completely from a highly cheap bartender who had absolutely already highly cowardly left the massive city. Chloe intensely looked directly at the highly beautiful portrait entirely of Victoria. The highly expensive diamonds, the absolute confidence, the highly genuine kindness entirely in her piercing eyes. I intimately knew her, Chloe whispered incredibly softly, directly to a highly unknown woman. Perfectly standing, perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to her. Yeah, absolutely, of course, the highly unknown stranger highly toxically sneered, violently pulling completely away. And I intimately know the highly famous Queen of England. Chloe intensely watched exactly as the highly heavy doors, entirely of the massive elevator, smoothly closed exactly when Victoria confidently stepped completely inside, beautifully rising directly into the bright sky. Chloe highly uncomfortably shifted the heavy baby, profoundly felt the massive, crushing weight entirely of her highly catastrophic mistakes, entirely in her highly empty, pathetic pockets, and smoothly turned entirely to confidently go completely back, completely out, directly into the freezing rain. Victoria absolutely did not actively look completely down. She was way too incredibly highly busy actively looking completely up. The highly secure elevator beautifully ascended, flawlessly carrying her directly to the highly beautiful clouds, directly to the highly massive future, and directly to a highly beautiful life that had finally, completely, undeniably become highly, truly, beautifully, her absolute own.